30 years. That is how long it took me to stop making the same category of mistake over and over again. And the worst part is that the mistakes don't announce themselves. They look like success for a season, sometimes two, and then the consequences show up in ways that take years to undo. A plant that has consumed an entire bed. A variety that looked beautiful in the catalog and turned out to be a nightmare to manage. A species I skipped for decades because someone told me it was boring. And when I finally planted it, I stood there in October looking at what it had done and felt genuinely embarrassed that I'd waited so long. Both kinds of regret belong on this list. The ones that cost me time and money and bed space I couldn't get back. And the ones I didn't plant, didn't take seriously, talked myself out of because I thought I already knew what they were. And found out I was wrong about all of it. This video is both of those things at once, and I want to be clear about that up front, because a title like this could go either direction, and what I'm giving you is harder than either one alone. 17 perennials. Some of them I regret planting, some of them I regret not planting sooner. And the distinction between those two categories is going to be obvious when we get to each one, I promise. What won't be obvious until we get there is number 12. Because number 12 is a plant I actively avoided for over a decade, based on a reputation it has in gardening circles that I now believe is almost entirely wrong. And the evidence I found when I finally dug into the research is the kind of thing that changes how you think about an entire category of plants. I'm not going to tell you what it is yet, but if you've ever dismissed a plant because someone told you it was invasive or aggressive or too much to manage, hold that thought until we get to 12, because the story is more complicated than you think. Before we start, drop a comment right now and tell me something I genuinely want to know. What's the longest you've ever let a perennial stay in your garden before finally admitting it wasn't working and pulling it out? 1 season, 5 years, 10 years? And tell me what state you're in. I ask because the tolerance people have for a struggling plant is something I find genuinely interesting, and it changes a lot by region and by gardening culture. Drop it below. Here is how I want you to understand this list as we go through it. Every perennial I'm going to tell you about, whether it's a regret I planted or a regret I waited, taught me something specific that I didn't know before I made the mistake. And the lesson isn't always obvious. Sometimes the lesson is about placement, sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes it's about the gap between what a plant looks like in its first season and what it becomes by year 4. Perennials are not annuals. The decision you make in May plays out over years. And if you're choosing based on what something looks like in a 4-inch pot under nursery lights, you are making a multi-year commitment based on a 12-week preview. That is the mistake I made more times than I want to admit, and almost every plant on this list is the direct result of it. The first regret on this list is one that I know is going to be controversial, and I want to explain my specific objection carefully rather than just putting it on the list and moving on. Mint. Not wild mint, not a species you find naturalized, any culinary mint you deliberately plant in open ground. Mentha spicata, Mentha piperita, any of them. I planted spearmint in a corner of a raised bed in my second year of gardening because I wanted fresh mint for cooking, and it was cheap and it looked manageable in the pot at the garden center. By year 3, it had moved through the bottom of the raised bed under the wooden frame and into the adjacent perennial border. By year 5, it was in 3 separate beds, and coming up through the lawn in 2 places. The rhizome system of culinary mint spreads underground in every direction simultaneously, and there is no organic method that reliably stops it once it's established in open soil. The correct way to grow culinary mint is in a container, always, with the bottom of the container not touching open soil. A pot with drainage holes sitting on open ground is still a risk. The roots find the holes and escape. Sit the container on a hard surface. Gravel, pavers, concrete. That is not excessive caution. That is what the plant's biology actually requires. I regret planting it in the ground. I do not regret growing it. Fresh mint is genuinely valuable in the kitchen and the fragrance is wonderful. But in ground, in an open bed, it cost me years of extraction work I would give anything to have avoided. The second regret is more painful because it took longer to reveal itself, and the plant looked so good for so long before the problem emerged. Obedient plant Physostegia virginiana produces tall, upright spikes of tubular pink or white flowers in late summer and fall that are genuinely beautiful and completely unique in form. The flowers can be moved along the stem and will hold their position, which is the origin of the common name and which is also completely irrelevant once you understand what this plant does underground. It spreads by rhizome with an aggression I was not prepared for. In good garden soil and amended loose, well-drained, it moves 2 to 3 feet in every direction per season. I planted 3 plants in a sunny border in year 4 of my garden, and by year 6, they had traveled through 12 feet of bed space and were coming up through the crowns of neighboring perennials. Removal required digging the entire bed. Every piece of rhizome left behind generates a new plant. And the plants that come up from fragments are vigorous. They don't look like struggling divisions. They look like established plants. If you want to grow obedient plant, grow it in a contained area, surrounded by hardscape on all sides or in a large container, and divide it aggressively every 2 years. In those conditions, it's manageable and genuinely beautiful. In open soil next to other plants, it will make decisions for you. The third entry on this list is a regret in the other direction, and I want to be honest about how long I avoided this one and why. Baptisia australis, false indigo, I skipped for 11 years. 11! Because every description I read said it was slow to establish, took 2 to 3 years to reach its potential, and didn't like being moved. Those 3 things added up in my head to difficult, and I reached for something faster every spring instead. What I missed during those 11 years was a plant that in year 3 produces 4-foot-tall spikes of deep cobalt blue flowers, unlike anything else in the spring garden, followed by inflated black seed pods that rattle and are beautiful in dried arrangements, followed by clean blue-green foliage that stays attractive all season, followed by nothing, because it goes dormant cleanly and needs 0 management through fall and winter. It fixes nitrogen in the soil. It is genuinely deer-resistant. It lives for 20 to 30 years in the same spot without being replaced. The math on 11 years of not planting it is real. I lost 11 seasons of bloom from a plant that would by now be one of the most established productive specimens in my entire garden. The slow establishment is real. The patience required is real. The regret of not starting sooner is also real, and it is larger. The fourth regret is one where my mistake was entirely about placement and would have been completely avoidable with better information. Ribbon grass, Phalaris arundinacea picta, is a striped ornamental grass with white and green variegation that looks clean and sophisticated in a garden photo and will take over an entire bed if you plant it in average garden soil with reasonable moisture. Hardy in USDA zones 4 through 9. It spreads by rhizome at a rate I was not ready for. And unlike some aggressive spreaders that give you warning signs in year 1, ribbon grass looks polite for the first season and then accelerates dramatically in year 2 and 3 once the rhizome network is established. I planted it along a fence line thinking it would stay put. It went under the fence and into the lawn on the other side. The correct application for ribbon grass is in a dry, poor soil situation where its spread rate is naturally suppressed by nutrition and moisture limits, or in a large container sunk into the ground with the rim above soil level. In those conditions, it is genuinely attractive and manageable. In a normal garden bed with amended soil, it is a commitment you will spend years reversing. The fifth entry shifts back to regret I waited, and this one is one of the most embarrassing admissions on the list because the plant is so widely available and so widely discussed that my avoidance of it for years was essentially snobbery. Karl Foerster feather reed grass, Calamagrostis ex acutiflora. I avoided for 7 years because I thought ornamental grasses were overused, overplanted, and visually boring. I was wrong in a way that is almost complete. Karl Foerster, in a garden context, does something I had not accounted for. It provides 4 genuine seasons of visual interest from a single upright clump that grows 4 to 6 feet tall without flopping, without spreading aggressively, and without requiring any management beyond one hard cut back to 4 to 6 inches in late February. Spring. Clean architectural vertical green. Summer. Feathery wheat-colored plumes that move in the breeze and catch afternoon light in a way that photographs cannot capture. Fall. The entire plant transitions to warm gold, and those plumes mature to dried wheat color. Winter. It stands, through frost, through snow, through everything. It is the only plant in my current garden that looks intentional in January. And I lost 7 years of that because I thought I already knew what it was. Winner of the Perennial Plant of the Year award, hardy in zones 4 through 9. I put it in this list as a regret because I want you to hear it from someone who made the mistake of dismissing it. Number 6 is a regret I planted, and one where the failure was entirely my fault for not reading the plant's requirements carefully enough. Gooseneck Lucistrife Lacemachia clethroides produces arching white flower spikes in midsummer that are genuinely striking, slightly curved at the tip like a goose's neck, and completely unlike most perennial flowers in form. I planted it because of those flowers. What I didn't process carefully enough was the warning that appears in every responsible description of this plant. It spreads by rhizome vigorously and is not suitable for mixed perennial borders. I read vigorous spreader and thought I could manage it. I could not. It moves fast and in multiple directions simultaneously, and the rhizome fragments that remain in soil after removal generate new plants with a reliability that is almost impressive. Hardy in USDA zones 3 through 8. In a contained area, a rain garden, a naturalized space where spread doesn't matter, it is beautiful and performs well. In a mixed border next to other perennials, it is a long-term problem. I should have read the plant more carefully. I didn't. I paid for it over 4 years of management. The 7th entry is a regret I waited, and it is one that I think will surprise the most people on this list, because the plant has a reputation in American gardening that I believe significantly undersells what it actually does. Solidago, goldenrod, specifically Solidago rugosa fireworks. I avoided for years because of its reputation as a weedy roadside plant and because of the widely held belief, which is incorrect, that it causes fall allergies. Goldenrod does not cause allergies. Ragweed does. They bloom simultaneously. Goldenrod has been blamed for ragweed's damage for decades because they share bloom time, and goldenrod is more visible. The actual mechanism: ragweed produces lightweight airborne pollen that enters your sinuses. Goldenrod produces heavy, sticky pollen carried exclusively by insects. It cannot become airborne. It has never caused an allergy attack in its existence. Once I understood that, I planted fireworks, named accurately. The flower stems arch outward in long, graceful sprays that radiate exactly like fireworks frozen mid-explosion, and watched it bloom in September and October in colors and forms that nothing else in my garden was producing at that time. It supports over 100 species of native bees, butterflies, and beneficial insects, hardy in zones 4 through 9. I regret the years I spent avoiding it based on a misconception that I could have corrected with 30 minutes of actual research. Now I want to say something directly to anyone who has been watching this far and hasn't subscribed yet. This channel puts out this level of content, specific, research-based, experience-driven, every single week, and YouTube's algorithm does not reliably deliver it to people who watch but don't subscribe. The next video I'm building is a follow-up to this one. The perennials I planted in the wrong place and what happened, with specific zone-by-zone guidance on where each one actually belongs. If that sounds like something you'd watch, subscribe now and turn the bell on. It will find you automatically. If you don't, there is a real chance it doesn't reach you at all. The 8th regret is one that involves a plant I planted correctly for the wrong reasons, and I want to explain what I mean by that. Silver mound Artemisia, Artemisia schmidtiana nana, forms a perfect dome-shaped mound of soft, feathery silver foliage that looks sculptural and elegant in early summer, and which collapses open in the center in the heat of midsummer in a way that looks like the plant is melting. The collapse is not disease. It is not pest damage. It is the plant's response to heat and humidity, and it happens reliably in zone 6 and warmer during the hottest weeks of summer. I planted it in zone 6 because it looked incredible in a gardening magazine from a cooler Pacific Northwest climate. And I spent 3 summers watching it look spectacular in May and June, and then open up like a deflating souffle in August. Hardy in zones 3 through 8. But the performance curve across that range is uneven in a way that most descriptions don't convey. In zones 3 through 5, where summers are cooler and less humid, it holds its form through summer much more reliably. In zones 6 through 8, especially in the humid east and south, the midsummer collapse is the norm, not the exception. cut it back hard in midsummer when it starts to open, and it recovers with fresh compact growth for fall. But that is management that the plant's description does not prepare you for. The next 4 entries on this list include the most consequential regret. I waited on the entire list, a plant I skipped for so long that admitting it here feels almost confessional. And they include number 12, the plant with the unfair reputation, which I promised at the beginning and which we're getting close to now. What comes next also includes 2 plants where my regret is specifically about quantity, not about the plant itself. I planted one when I should have planted 7, and the difference between one specimen and a mass planting is so dramatic that they're almost not the same garden decision. Number 9 is a regret I waited, and the regret is specifically about duration. Helleborus orientalis, Lenten Rose. I planted for the first time 9 years ago. That is 9 years after I should have. It blooms in late winter and early spring, February through April depending on zone, in white, cream, pale yellow, pink, deep plum, burgundy, and near black, with spotted interiors that you only see when you tilt the flower toward you. The foliage is evergreen, thick, deeply cut, and stays attractive through all 4 seasons, providing structure and ground cover in shaded areas when nothing else is showing color. Hardy in zones 4 through 9. Deer avoid it completely. The entire plant contains compounds that make it unpalatable to wildlife, which is an extraordinary advantage in deer-pressured gardens. It tolerates dry shade once established, which is the condition that defeats most shade perennials. It self-seeds prolifically, and the seedlings are variable, not identical to the parent, which means every season brings new color combinations. The first year I grew it, I bought 2 plants. By year 3, I had a small colony from self-seeding. By year 9, I have a significant naturalized planting under a mature oak where almost nothing else grew before. The regret is 9 years of not having that planting, 9 years of fighting that dry shade problem with plants that kept failing, when the solution was available at any specialty nursery the whole time. Number 10 is a regret about quantity, and I want to be specific about why quantity matters with this particular plant. Nepeta, catmint, specifically Walker's Low, I planted as 1 or 2 specimens in borders for years and thought it was a nice but unremarkable plant. The thing I didn't understand until a landscape designer pointed it out is that catmint is a mass planting plant. 1 plant looks pleasant, 5 plants in a row look designed. A long drift of Walker's Low along a pathway edge, allowed to cascade and flow and blur the hard line between stone and soil, looks like something that costs serious money to install. Hardy in zones 3 through 8. It blooms lavender blue from late spring through midsummer, cut it back by half after first bloom, and it flowers again in late summer, 2 full seasons from 1 plant. Deer avoid it completely, drought tolerant, and when mass planted, the scent on a warm afternoon from those aromatic silver-gray leaves is one of the most pleasant things a garden can offer. I regret a decade of planting 1 or 2 at a time and calling it done. The plant only shows you what it is when you give it enough room to become a sweep. Number 11 is a regret I planted with a very specific and avoidable cause. Chameleon plant, Houtunia cordata, I planted because the foliage variegation is genuinely striking. Green, red, yellow, and cream in irregular patches on heart-shaped leaves, and a cultivar called chameleon is one of the most visually unusual foliage perennials available. It is also in moist soil in zones 5 through 9, one of the most aggressive spreading plants I have ever grown, and the rhizome network it establishes in good soil is so extensive and so deep that removal is genuinely difficult. Not hard to kill, impossible to fully eradicate in 1 season. Every fragment of rhizome left behind generates a new plant. I spent 2 full growing seasons removing it from a bed where I had planted it without adequate research, and fragments were still appearing in year 3. The correct container for this plant is a pot with no drainage holes at the bottom sitting on a hard surface. It is a water-loving plant that looks beautiful in a large container where moisture is constant and the rhizomes are contained. In open soil, it makes every decision on its own terms, and most of those decisions will not be yours. Number 12. I told you at the beginning that this one involved a reputation I now believe is almost entirely wrong, and I want to explain exactly what I mean because the nuance matters. Comfrey, Symphytum officinale, has a reputation in gardening circles as an invasive, impossible-to-remove plant, and that reputation is earned by a specific growing condition that most descriptions don't qualify. In good, moist, fertile garden soil, comfrey does self-seed aggressively, and the taproot is deep enough that pulling the plant removes the crown but leaves root fragments that regenerate. That is the version of comfrey that earned the reputation. The Bocking 14 strain, a sterile hybrid that does not set viable seed, changes that calculation completely. Bocking 14 does not self-seed. It spreads only through the root system at a rate that is manageable with annual division. And what it gives you in return is a deep-rooted perennial that mines subsoil nutrients unavailable to shallow-rooted plants, accumulates those nutrients in its leaves, and produces leaves that, when cut and left on the soil surface, or composted, are one of the most potassium-rich organic soil amendments available to home gardeners. Potassium drives flower and fruit production. A comfrey chop and drop around fruiting plants in spring delivers a slow-release potassium amendment that commercial fertilizer companies sell in bags at garden centers for money you don't need to spend. Hardy in zones 3 through 9. The blue or purple flowers attract bumblebees with an intensity that is visible and audible from several feet away. I avoided this plant for over a decade based on the reputation of the seeding species. Bocking 14 is a different plant. I regret not knowing the difference sooner, and I regret not having it in my garden for the decade I spent buying potassium fertilizer instead. That is what I promised you at the beginning of this video, and I mean every word of it. Drop your reaction in the comments. Specifically, had you heard of Bocking 14 before this video, or did you write off comfrey the same way I did? Because I find out something about this community every time I ask a specific question, and I want to know how widespread that misconception actually is. Number 13 is a regret about timing that had real financial consequences. Peony, Paeonia, lactiflora. I planted too late, in too small a size, and with incorrect depth. And the combination of those 3 mistakes cost me 4 additional years of not having blooms before I figured out what went wrong. Peonies bloom in late spring for 2 to 3 weeks, with flowers up to 10 inches across that are among the most fragrant and visually dramatic of any perennial available to American gardeners. Hardy in zones 3 through 8. They live for 100 years in the same spot. There are peonies in American gardens right now planted by great-grandparents. The planting depth mistake is the one that causes the most silent damage. The eyes, the reddish growth buds on the root, must be planted no more than 1 to 2 inches below the soil surface. Too deep and the plant grows vigorously but never blooms, sometimes for years. I planted at 3 inches. I waited 3 springs with no flowers before someone finally asked me how deep I'd planted, and I understood what had happened. The regret is not the peony. I love them entirely. The regret is 3 years of bloom I lost to a mistake that is in every planting guide, and that I somehow didn't apply carefully enough. Number 14 is a regret I waited that involves a plant I dismissed because I thought the name was literal, and the reality is nothing like the name. Joe Pye weed, Eutrochium purpureum. Sounds like something that grows along a drainage ditch, and is technically in the weed family in the sense that it's a Native American wildflower that does grow in disturbed areas. What it is, in a garden context, is a 6 to 8 foot tall architectural perennial that produces large domed clusters of mauve-pink flowers in late summer and fall, at exactly the moment when most gardens are winding down and desperately need something tall, structural, and alive. Hardy in zones 3 through 8. The flowers are one of the primary late-season nectar sources for monarch butterflies in the eastern and central flyways, documented by Monarch Watch as a critical fueling stop on the migration route to Mexico. The seed heads that follow the flowers feed birds through winter. It handles part shade, handles moist soil, handles clay. Conditions that defeat most tall perennials. I dismissed it for 7 years because the name sounded wrong, and I found out too late that the plant itself is one of the most valuable things I could have added to my garden for wildlife, for structure, and for late-season color. Number 15 is a regret I planted in the category of wrong expectations rather than wrong plant. Ornamental allium, specifically Allium giganteum or Allium gladiator, produces enormous spherical purple flower heads on tall, straight stems in late spring that are genuinely spectacular and look unlike anything else in the garden. I planted a large quantity of them, expecting a repeat performance every year without intervention. What I got instead was a first year of spectacular bloom, a second year of reduced bloom from bulbs that had divided and weakened themselves, and by year 3 a sparse and disappointing performance from a planting I'd invested real money in. Ornamental alliums are technically perennial, but perform best when treated more like short-lived perennials that need dividing every 2 to 3 years or supplementing with fresh bulbs. The foliage also dies back before the flowers finish, leaving an untidy gap that needs to be hidden by surrounding plants. Hardy in zones 4 through 8. None of this is a reason not to grow them. The bloom is worth it, but the expectation management that gardening guides rarely provide is this: budget for supplementing the planting every 3 years and plant them behind emerging perennials that will hide the dying foliage. I didn't know either of those things when I started, and the disappointment of year 3 was entirely avoidable. Number 16 is one of the most expensive mistakes in time and money I made in 30 years, and I'm telling it here because the warning is specific enough to be useful. Japanese knotweed. I planted it. I know exactly how that sounds. It was sold to me at a native plant sale. Incorrectly, the seller was wrong about what it was, as a large ornamental grass with attractive foliage, and I planted it in a sunny border with open soil on 3 sides. Japanese knotweed is classified as an invasive species in most American states. It spreads by rhizome at a rate that is genuinely alarming. The rhizomes go down several feet and extend laterally 10 to 15 feet or more per season, and the root fragments that remain after any removal attempt regenerate with complete reliability. I spent 5 years trying to remove it, and eventually had to hire someone with specialized equipment to excavate the bed to a depth of 3 feet. This is not a plant anyone should intentionally grow. I am telling you this story because it happened to me, and because the lesson: verify what you are planting, especially from informal sellers, especially anything described as a fast-spreading ornamental, is worth the embarrassment of admitting the mistake. 17, the last entry, and I want to end on a regret I waited because that is the better feeling to leave you with. Echinacea, coneflower. I grew for years in the standard purple species and thought I knew it completely. The modern hybrid cultivars: Magnus for larger deep rose purple flowers, Cheyenne Spirit for a mixed color range in warm tones, Pow Wow Wild Berry for a compact deep rose form. I avoided for a long time because I was skeptical of modern bred varieties in a species I thought worked fine in its original form. What I found when I finally planted Magnus is a cultivar with significantly larger flower heads, more saturated color, and a longer bloom season than the straight species, with the same cold hardiness across zones 3 through 9 and the same wildlife value. Goldfinches feeding on seed heads through winter, monarchs and swallowtails working the flowers through summer. The original species is not wrong. The improved cultivars are just better in most garden applications, and I wasted years of better performance by not giving them a fair chance based on a preference for the original that I can't fully justify. Here is how this list maps onto practical decisions you can make this season. If you are planning a new bed and you're tempted by any plant whose description includes the words vigorous spreader, or naturalizes readily, or spreads by rhizome, that is not a warning to ignore. That is information about what the plant will do in your soil. In a contained area, a naturalized space, or a bed surrounded by hardscape, some of those plants are genuinely excellent choices. In a mixed perennial border with open soil and neighboring plants, they will cost you years of management you didn't budget for. Mint, obedient plant, ribbon grass, gooseneck leucostrife, chameleon plant. All 5 of those regrets on this list share that common thread, and all 5 could have been avoided by taking the warning in the description seriously rather than assuming I could manage the spread. If your challenge is a specific difficult condition, dry shade, moist soil, late season gaps, deer pressure, bird support through winter, cross-reference those conditions with the regret I waited entries on this list. Baptisia for dry to average sunny conditions. hellebore for dry shade and deer pressure, Karl Foerster for four-season structure without maintenance, Joe Pye weed for moist soil and late-season wildlife value, goldenrod for late-season color and native pollinator support, comfrey bocking 14 for soil improvement and bumblebee habitat. Those 6 plants together address more difficult gardening conditions than almost any other combination I could offer you, and I spent years either avoiding them or underusing them. 2 things about perennial gardening that I wish someone had said to me plainly in year 1. The first, the plants that look most impressive in a 4-inch nursery pot are frequently the plants that cause the most management problems at year 3 and 4. The ones that look modest, the ones that take 2 years to establish, the ones that don't photograph well in the catalog. Those are often the plants that will still be performing beautifully in 20 years without asking anything from you. Baptisia, hellebore, Karl Foerster, goldenrod, Joe Pye weed. All of them look unremarkable when small. All of them become irreplaceable once established. The second thing, a regret I planted and a regret I waited can look identical in the short term. Both involve a plant that isn't performing the way you hoped in its first or second year. The difference is in the direction. Is the plant doing less than expected or more than expected in the wrong direction? Less is usually patience. More, in the spreading sense, is usually a plant that is doing exactly what its biology programmed it to do, in conditions that suit it perfectly, and the management demand is not going to decrease on its own. I want to end this video with something I don't say enough. Making gardening mistakes is not a sign that you're doing it wrong. It is the sign that you're actually doing it, that you are putting plants in the ground, watching what happens, making adjustments, and building knowledge that doesn't come from any video or book, including this one. The regrets on this list are real, and some of them cost me real time and money, but every single one of them taught me something specific that made every subsequent season better. If you've been gardening for a few years and you have your own list of plants you wish you'd skipped and plants you wish you'd started sooner, you are not behind. You are exactly where every experienced gardener has been. This channel exists to compress that learning curve as much as possible. And if this video gave you even one piece of that, the next one goes just as deep. Subscribe now, not because the algorithm needs it, though it does, but because you deserve to not miss what comes next. And this is the kind of content that is genuinely harder to find than it should be. And before you go, I want you to tell me something specific. Tell me the one plant that gave you the biggest surprise, in either direction, spectacular success or spectacular failure. And tell me what zone you're in. Because those 2 data points together are the most useful thing I can get from this community, and the patterns in those answers directly shape what I build next. Drop it below. I read all of them, every single one. Now go look at your garden differently.